All right, so are Britain and France, and thereby, as a consequence, Europe itself seeing a leftward turn? Joining me now is Sir Martin Wolf. He's the chief economics commentator with the Financial Times newspaper. Thank you very much, Sir Martin Wolf, for joining us. Let me start off by asking you, with the election victories in Britain and France, Labour coming back to power after 14 years, in France, a left-wing coalition all set to form power, do you see this as a turning point, kind of a defining moment, if you will, in the politics of Europe, where after a decade or so of centre-right governments in a number of places in Europe, is Europe now taking a leftward turn?
It's very complicated. I think there are two or three answers to this. First, what we've seen above all is the fickleness of politics, if you like, the instability of politics. There's a lot of evidence that voters are unhappy. There's a loss of trust in government, and that their ties, their allegiance to their past parties, the parties they used to believe in, has gone. So they are very fickle. And so I don't think this is necessarily permanent in any way. I could imagine quite a different government in Britain or maybe in France 5 years or so from now. So that's the first point. Second, you have to remember that the centre-right is still very powerful in Europe. It's certainly, the far right is certainly rising, and it's done very well in the European parliamentary election. So I think it's definitely a mistake to say that the far right is gone. However, it's crucial to remember that in no country has the far right got close to a majority of the votes. France is probably the country in which it's biggest. And that being so, if the other parties and the supporters of the other parties unite, as they clearly have done, either directly, they've united formally, or they have through agreements among parties or simply decisions of voters to vote against the far right loses. So I would say it's not a new era of stability. What it shows is the far right is ultimately still a minority in every country. There is lots of resistance to it, which is complicated. And the big point, I think, is the future of European politics is rather unpredictable now, and I certainly would not dare to predict it.
How would you square this, Sir Martin Wolf, with what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic with the U.S. elections? There is a lot of pressure on the incumbent Democratic President Joe Biden to withdraw from the race. He's had a very poor debate performance. There are very big question marks on his capability, his mental faculties, and what looks like an inevitable return of Donald Trump.
Well, I think it's basically the same story in the sense that in one respect, the U.S. is deeply divided. Remember, the Republicans haven't won a plurality of the vote in a presidential election for a very long time. Donald Trump never won a plurality of the vote. So it's not as if the Americans are all far right. Nothing is further from the truth. Of course, the American electoral setup is very peculiar, so you can win the presidency with a minority of the votes. And of course, events make a big difference. My own guess would be that a strong candidate, if Biden were fully healthy and vigorous, running on his record, which has really been quite impressive, he would win pretty comfortably. As it is, through the bad luck or the mistake of sticking with him when it was becoming obvious, must have been obvious, that he was not in good form and was deteriorating, and they're choosing a man of 82 who will be 86 at the end of his term. Yeah. That might well open the way to Donald Trump. But it's important to stress, whatever Donald Trump does with his presidency, and I'm pretty frightened about it, he doesn't have a majority of the American population and never has. And that's not going to change.
I do want to ask you, over the last few years, particularly with the rise of Trump and Erdogan in Turkey and Modi here in India, in the democratic world, there seemed to be an affinity towards strongmen rulers. There was a growing sense of fatigue with the establishment, with the status quo. Do you see that changing? There's, for example, a new Pew Research poll out today which suggests that particularly in the developed world, people are not happy with democracy. They don't see democracy as working for them. Do you see any of that changing given the results that we've seen in both Britain and France?
Well, I think that's a very complicated story. I would say if you look around the world, right at the moment, it looks a bit encouraging for those of us on the liberal democratic side, broadly defined. I would put, if I may say, Mr. Modi in a slightly different category because he's the only strongman ruler I can think of in the broadly democratic world who's actually competent. He is unquestionably a highly competent person. But I must say, I, along with many others, was very encouraged by the recent Indian election because it shows the Indian people still can make up their own minds, which is utterly wonderful. So he's been a bit chastened, which always seems to be a good thing. Mr. Erdogan had a very bad election result in the local elections. He's been in power a long time and he's made quite a mess. So I'm optimistic he might go. As long as there are still elections, proper elections, there's always the possibility of turfing them out. The British and the French elections both show that the centre-left is alive. It still has sizable support. And of course, in both cases, the people have been voting against the incumbent power system. In French, Macron, they're clearly totally fed up with him. And in Britain, they were totally fed up with the Conservatives, who were a shambles. You're absolutely right. The cost of living crisis, these economic shocks have been very important. We've had huge shocks, the pandemic, the inflation, the energy price surge. All these explain the dissatisfaction with governments. The immigration is a huge political problem too. But ultimately, I think if the government is a shambles, one of the great glories of democracy is we can get rid of it without a revolution, without a civil war. And this is, to me, one of the most wonderful things about democracy. And I would say, looking around so far, it's been working not too badly. And it's just what I would like. If you think of China, they will never get rid of Xi Jinping, even though in my view they should. So I still believe and trust that the people will make the right decision in the end.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Sir Martin Wolf, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for joining us here on CNN News 18.